Hello and welcome back to another GiantSlayer TFT ranked meta video. Today we'll be breaking down where the ranked meta settled over the course of patch 12.6. Of course, the B patch will be the major focus as it did alter the meta in multiple ways. Besides briefly looking at what those changes were, we'll also be doing the usual covering of the meta items, a breakdown of each stage of the game, and important moments like augments. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, let's talk about what changed with the B patch. Surprisingly, there weren't too many drastic meta shifts after the B patch. What mostly happened was Warwick got toned down to a more manageable level and Sivir Hextech nosedived to mid-tier composition. The rest of the adjustments weren't too impactful. Twitch reroll was already an outlier composition that required significant early game high rolling to do well, and Talon was also on the fringe of the meta. That said, Talon definitely fell out of viability after the B patch. But the defining characteristics of the meta remained roughly the same. As the 12.6 patch initially nerfed the ever-loving heck out of AD boards, AP quickly took over and eventually filled the void after the Warwick and Hextech nerfs. There was already a shift towards the late game in the 12.6 meta, but the B patch just reinforced it further. This means a good portion of players aimed for a faster level 8, usually during stage 4, and relied less so on hitting stable boards at level 7 or 6. 5-cost champions were also the big winners of both the initial patch and the B patch. Silco in particular made a return to being one of the most sought-after late-game splash champions. All in all, the B patch mostly took the top two builds, Warwick and Sivir Hextech, and brought them down below where the rest of the meta was. With that, AP boards and late-game champions took over as the dominant way to play the current meta. Let's move on now and talk about the opening carousel and item priority. Items and components definitely changed in priority after the B patch. Prior to it, Bow was by far the best option since it built into multiple items for both Warwick and Sivir. After the B patch, with AP compositions being the most common boards, components like Rod and Tear were much higher in priority. That said, Bow still had a great place because GiantSlayer is a really good item regardless of what type of damage is doing well. Sword and Glove definitely fell down in value because of the lack of AD comps. Champions like Draven and Jhin did rise a bit up in valuability, but overall items like Infinity Edge or Last Whisper just weren't as useful anymore. Swords still bring some value as either Shojin or Gunblade, but those aren't the types of items players slam early. Glove always has a place in the game with Shroud, but being primarily used for IE or JG meant Glove went way down in priority. That brings us to the question of which component has the highest priority. As we've said too many times so far, AP is the way to go right now, which does mean Rod and Tear are likely the most contested options. Rod builds into a multitude of items, and Tear generally being used for blue buff or in some cases Shojin. Both Chain Vest and Belt actually went up in value because of the early slam items like Morellonomicon and Locket. Slamming items early generally translates to health saved or even a win streak, so anything that gives a spike in stage 2 and 3 is usually prioritized. That's really what it comes down to, is what items can you make early game while still having components left later on to build for your main carry. It's definitely a tough act to juggle, but using 4 components to gain an advantage is often worth it, meaning what components you prioritize matters less than what items you make after the PvE rounds are over in stage 1. We could keep talking about components and items for days, but let's continue on into the early game, starting with stage 1. Stage 1 continues to be the same as always, though we do recommend looking for a Yordle opener if possible. Yordles like Corki and Gnar do a fantastic job as item holders, and even though Corki openers tend to be for loss streaking, it's possible to win streak as well. Either way, the increased gold generated from a free Yordle every round is quite useful. Another opening board to look for is VIP Brand, specifically with blue buff. Brand is the perfect item holder for AP champions, and having VIP activated with 3 Debonair makes Brand one of the best early game carries in general. But it can be unreliable if you're not able to 2-star Brand quickly or if that 3rd Debonair remains elusive. Those two openings aside, stage 1 is usually going to be about finding pairs and looking for cohesive traits, so don't sweat it too much if you don't end up with the perfect board going into stage 2. But before stage 2 rolls around, we need to talk about the first major decision of every game, the 1/4 Augment. The first augment choice of the game has the most flexibility in terms of what players can pick. The general idea that economy augments are weaker than combat augments is certainly true later on in the game, but to begin with, econ augments are perfectly fine to take. With that said, it does depend a lot on the tier of the augment. Silver augments are relatively low in power, so a player can end up with more of an advantage taking Treasure Trove than say Tier 1 Disintegrator. There are a few combat augments worth taking in this tier, such as Luden's Echo, Cybernetic Augments, Phalanx, or Backfoot, but none of them are game-breaking. Gold augments, on the other hand, are harder to choose between because there's quite a few of them that are amazing for econ efficiency like Trade Sector or True 2s, while there's also quite a lot of great general combat augments. Our recommendation here is to take your time, scout, and see what others take. If you can take an econ augment, this is the best round to do that. If a lot of players are going for combat, it may be the better choice, just so you don't end up behind in augments later on in the game. Finally, prismatic augments are just crazy in general. Don't get caught in the trap of taking specific augments pertaining to traits unless you have no other viable option. Err on the side of boring for prismatic augments because any combat ones are generally really good. That said, 1-4 is the only time things like Level Up, March of Progress, or Golden Ticket will give any value at all, so keep those in mind. Overall, the 1-4 augment definitely has the most flexibility in augment choices. Just be aware, if you don't take a combat augment here, you will definitely want one later on. Now, on to Stage 2. This stage is mainly about going on either a win or loss streak. Generally speaking, Yordles and Mercenary openers are perfect choices to go on a loss streak with, while cohesive boards with a 2-star item holder are what you want for win streaking. Having a combat augment also helps with winning, specifically if it's a gold or prismatic augment. As mentioned earlier, Brand can be used as an AP item holder, but don't get trapped by him too long if you don't have a VIP Brand with 3 Debonair. Twitch can still do well early game with Chemtech, and Innovator Scrap openers, specifically with Ezreal carry, are still viable. Try to stay away from slamming AD items just because there's fewer options later on in the game, though an item like Giant Slayer or Hand of Justice is flexible between both board types. The main theme of Stage 2 is to preserve health when possible and build up your economy. Win streaking has the advantage of preserving the most amount of health, while loss streaking gives Carousel priority. Play whatever style suits you best. With that, we can move into the mid-game with Stage 3. The only viable reroll build to worry about is still Warwick, though Twitch, Brand, Talon, and Syndra reroll boards are all playable. We recommend generally avoiding any reroll boards unless you have an insanely good opener for them. That means the goal for Stage 3 is to keep up with the leveling curve by hitting level 6 on either 3-1 or 3-2, depending on if you're win streaking. As for rolling at level 6, well, we advise not doing it unless your board is extremely weak and you are already on a loss streak in Stage 2. This is particularly true for Mercenary players since you want to begin aiming for a cash out by the end of Stage 3. When rolling, we recommend looking for an item holder such as Lucian, Gnar, Corki, Misfortune, or Malzahar. Then all you need is a couple of good frontline champions and, if possible, a trait to pair with your carry. Most players skip through Stage 3, so the real decision to be made is, of course, the 3-3 Augment. We recommend for this augment, regardless of what tier it is, to take some type of utility or combat-focused augment. It can be okay to take an econ augment, but you will be at a disadvantage against the boards going into Stage 4 if you do, so weigh your current board strength compared to the rest of the lobby before making that decision. While health is a resource, you never want to be heavily pressured at level 7 to spend all of your gold to stabilize, and skipping a strong combat augment on 3-3 can often lead to that. It is possible to take a trait-specific augment on 3-3 because you have an idea of where your board is going. Arcanist, for example, is an easy-to-put-together board that you may have pieces for in Stage 3. That means an augment like Runic Shield or having an Arcanist emblem may be worthwhile to take. But in general, we advise to stay away from too specific of augments unless you know for sure it will be useful later on. Overall, this augment round is a bit more straightforward, so it shouldn't be too difficult to come to a decision, as most of the time, the best augment is obvious. Time for Stage 4, where most of the lobby will hit level 7 and likely roll a bit of gold. With the meta favoring the late game and 5-cost champions, we recommend not rolling too much if possible. Sticking with a 3-cost carry and upgraded frontline should be plenty to get you through level 7. The goal should be to keep enough of an economy to hit level 8 sometime between 4-2 and 5-1. The more high roll the early game was, the faster you can hit level 8. Just keep in mind that the rule of thumb for leveling is to have at least 30 gold left over so that you can roll for meaningful upgrades. There's no benefit to spending all of your gold leveling if you don't have any real power spike to be gained afterwards. Let's briefly talk about the current meta compositions. Orc is really the only common reroll board you'll see anymore, and even then, it's not too common after the nerfs. Most 3-cost reroll boards are also dead in the meta, though Lucian Twinshot is definitely viable. For the most part, the meta revolves around AP boards like Arcanist, Twinshot, or Innovator. Champions like Orianna, Seraphine, Malzahar, Ahri, Vex, and Lucian can all be built around. There's a few outlier builds for AD like Draven, Jhin, and Sivir, but they can be difficult to pull off. What the meta is really about is 5-cost champions. Victor, Jinx, Jace, and Silco are the bread and butter of the meta, and building a board around them is the best way to consistently top 4. Jace usually means Innovators, Jinx Twin Shot, and Victor Arcanist or Chemtech. Suko is the best splash champion in the game, so he fits really with any board. It can be difficult to both find and 2-star any 5-cost champion, which is why leveling to 8 early with a good economy is important. Finally, we can talk about the last major decision of the game, the 4/6 Augment. But honestly, this isn't a difficult decision to make because the overarching theme of this Augment choice is to pick whatever your board needs. Whether that's a combat augment pertaining to your board, or maybe you need an emblem for a trait and one of the augments helps with that. The only hard rule is to almost never take an economy augment unless you desperately need gold to roll, or you're in a strong position to sit on something like Golden Egg. But for the most part, this augment round is the easiest to make a decision on, since all that matters is providing the most value to your board. Despite the late game being where the meta is centered around, there aren't a whole lot of decisions to be made. At level 8, ideally before 5-3, and then put together a board that best fits your current composition, items, and augments. That's really it, besides focusing on scouting and positioning. The only real decision is whether or not to level to 9, and that is heavily dependent on your board state and position in the lobby. If you can safely level to 9 with gold to roll, do so, otherwise stick to rolling on level 8. That's really all there is for the late game. And that's all there is for today's video, folks. There isn't a lot of excitement for patch 12.6 because the big patch of the set is 12.7, as that's the patch for the World's Tournament. So with that in mind, let us know in the comment section below what you're looking forward to being changed in patch 12.7. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.